Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to implement the presentation layer under authentication feature. From the previous application of Jetpack Compose, we can infer basically the auth event. Next, let's define the auth state. And for testing purposes, it has to conform to the protocol compatible. We're going to override this later on. The first state, which is basically the authenticated user, let's provide here a public initializer. And then we'd like to define a function, copy function. Next, we have to override the protocol compatible. We need to define how two instances are the same, basically of type auth state. The left side of type auth state and the right side of type auth state. It has to give us Boolean are equal if the left side and the authenticated user equal right side and authenticated user. And the authenticated user of type user conform to the equatable protocol. The form type, login and register. Now we are ready to implement the auth view model. And again, it should be main actor and it should be of type observable objects. Auth state, we need to define here the login state as well as register state. We're going to do that accordingly. We need an instance of the use cases. And because we're going to deal with publishers, we need cancellables. And it's defined on auth event that should implement internally the events. Now we have to create those on refresh user data, set authenticated user and logout. Let's start implementing the first one, which is on refresh user data. First of all, we need to make sure that the use cases is not null. And we have to call use cases get authenticated user. And because it's a publisher, I'm going to receive the values on the dispatch queue main. I'm going to call sync. In case of failure, I'm going to call the function on refresh failed. Next, we need to update the state of auth states. Therefore, we have to use here before resource the weak self, and this is a nullable value. Therefore, I'm going to add guard let self else and return. In case of success, we're going to update the state by doing auth state equal auth state and copy. The authenticated user is data. In case of error, there is no need actually to add here break. In case of error, we're going to call on refresh failed. Default case, we are not interested in the default case. Therefore, I'm going to do here break. Nothing to do. Store and cancellables. Now it's going to complain about the any publisher is not sendable. I couldn't think of a better solution, so I have no other option to mark this pre-concurrency. Tells the compiler to treat all the types under combine as pre-Swift concurrency and ignore the sendable requirements. I couldn't think of other option. I'm going to leave it this way, and perhaps in the future I'm going to solve this problem. But for us, it won't cause any problem during tests in our application. Let's implement the other one, which is to set authenticated user. We're going to update the state, auth state, and copy. Here we have a small catch, if you will. Under this authenticated user, if you do, for example, user, it's not going to work in your UI. Therefore, we have to do some and pass here the user as an argument. This is very tricky. We have one last function, which is basically logout. First things first, we need to make sure that the instance use cases is not null. Then we will call the use cases and logout. We are not interested in the results. We're going to do await and use cases logout, and we have to pass basically the user ID from the parameter. And we have to add here try. Afterward, we have to call on logged out to show, for example, the snack bar message and call on error. Now let's focus on the login section and the register section. Under components, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it login and register. And we have another folder for toolbar. For the login section, it's going to have only the dedicated events as well as the state and the components or the view. Likewise for register, and for the toolbar, it's going to have the dedicated view model as we have done basically under the Jetpack Compose application. Let's define the needed login form events. The first event is to toggle the visibility of the password, to set the alert message as well as the visibility. And the last one is the login function. Now we have to define the state of this login form. From the previous Jetpack Compose application, we can infer the needed states. And to make our life easier, we're going to define the function copy. We're going to use this basically under the view model. I would like to add here some computed properties for validation. As email error, this will return validator is valid email. Because we have added here a flag, should validate in order to avoid validating from the get-go. Therefore, here we're going to do, we should validate. This is going to be triggered only when we are clicking on the login button. We're going to change this state to true, and we're going to check basically for the email. Likewise, for the password, if we have a valid password. Let's define the related events and the state for the register. The first event to toggle the visibility of the password as well as the password confirmation. We need to set the message as well as the visibility of the alert and the alert type, either success or error. Let's add the enum register alert type. It is basically success or error. Let's come back to the register form event and let's add the event that's going to set the alert message as well as the visibility and the alert type, and the register event and the event to reset all the fields. From the Jetpack Compose application, we can infer the states of register form states, copy function, and some computed properties to check if we have a valid name or a valid username or a valid email or a valid password and valid password confirmation. Now for the validation of the username, count less than 5 characters, and it should validate. For the email, it's pretty much the same thing that we have done earlier by using the validator. Now for the password, we're going to use isValidPassword from the validator. And the last validation, we need to make sure that the password and password confirmation are equal. And those are 4 computed properties. Right now, let's continue implementing the auth view model because we have to centralize everything under the auth view model, the same thing that we have done under the Jetpack Compose application. We need to add 2 other states for the register form as well as login form and for the register form. Dedicated events that should be implemented internally by using the use cases for the login form and the register form. All right, we have a lot of events to deal with. First of all, we need to make sure that the use case is not null. Then we have to change the state of should validate to true. I'm trying to enhance the user experience for our application. We need to trigger the use case and we need to receive those values under the main dispatch queue, and we have to do sync weak self. Now, if we have an error, we're going to change the state of loading to false, and we have to call here on error and pass error as an argument. And if we can have emissions from the stream of data and to avoid memory leaks, we have to do weak self, and let's rename this to user. Now, because the user is null, we're going to do if let user underneath store under cancellables. All right, we're going to update the state is loading false. For the email, it's going to be empty, just to reset the fields, password as well, and should validate false to come back to the initial state. And we have to change basically the state of the authenticated user. Right now we have a user, therefore we have to change the state to keep the data in sync. And if you do remember, under the Jetpack Compose application, we need to show a snack bar message. If you try to call here, for example, a callback function, let's call it, for example, login success, and in your view, you're going to show the snack bar message, what's going to happen every time the user is going to trigger or to toggle on and off a product in wishlist, it's going to trigger the changes of the database. Therefore, the stream of data is going to change, and it's going to result in calling the callback function and showing the snack bar message. Therefore, we have to think of something to trigger a one-time event. We have solved this issue under Kotlin by using shared flow. Now, under Swift, we have something called a pass-through. The pass-through subject is a type of publisher that's going to allow us to send values manually. It doesn't store the last value. It simply passes through the value to its subscribers, which is good for our case. It's going to serve basically here the one-time event strategy that we are looking for. Therefore, I'm going to create here a public value. I'm going to call it login success. Basically, this is the event equal pass through subject of type user and never. In our login function, we're going to send the value. It's going to be sent only one time. Now, if we have an error, set is loading to false and should validate to false, and we have to call the function on error. Let's implement the other function, toggle confirm password visible. Next, we have to implement the function register. As usual, we need to make sure that the use cases is not null. Let's implement a function. Let's call it isValidRegister form. We can call register form is valid if there is no errors under username, email, password, and password confirmation. Let's use this under register. First of all, we need to make sure that the form is valid. After the form is valid, we're going to change the state of is loading to true. And before checking whether the form is valid or not, we are not interested in the result of calling try and await, use cases, and register. Afterward, we have to call on register and on reset. Don't worry about on reset, we're going to define this later on. If we have an error, we're going to call on error. I would like to check the login function. I'm going to add a private function, let's call it isValid login form. We can say that the login form is valid if there is no errors under email and password. I'm going to fold this section. Login form is valid, then we can proceed. And after the form is valid, we need to set the progress indicator to true. Let's implement the function on reset. Basically, it's going to set name, email, and password confirmation to the initial values, as well as should validate. We have to implement another function, which is toggle password visible, and we have to deal with both forms, login form and register form, in order to avoid code duplication. In case of login is password visible to the opposite value of is password visible. In case of register, likewise, and that's it. Let's do, for example, set alert, and we have to handle both cases for login form as well as register form. In case of login state, we have to change the alert text as well as the alert visible. In case of register error, we're going to change the state of alert text, alert visible, and alert type. And that's all for the implementation of Auth view model. We are not going to implement a dedicated view model for toolbar. Everything is going to be handled under the Auth view model. At this particular stage, we are ready to make our integration test for the Auth view model. Let's go ahead under presentation, screen, create a dedicated test for this Auth view model. We need basically the instance of the view model to test, and the view model depends on the memory database, mock crypto, as well as the use cases. Now we have to override the function setup with error to provide the needed dependencies. For the first test, we need to make sure that the login function should authenticate the user, and this function should basically be annotated with the main actor, because the creation of the view model needs to be annotated under a saved thread environment. First of all, let's create the view model, and let's make sure the instance of view model and memory database are not null. Under the same section of arrangement, we have to arrange the expectation since we are dealing with publishers. We need to arrange another expectation that should be related to the one-time event that we have done earlier, which is the login success event. With the same manner that we have proceeded with under the products view model test, we need to add the observed login state to an array as well as the observed auth states. We're going to act with the correct email and password, and I would like to initialize here a variable login success user of type user for the pass-through subject that we have done under the auth view model. Before acting, we need to observe three states basically. The first state, which is for the pass-through subject, the second one for the auth state, and the third one for the login form state. For the first one, which is dedicated to the login success pass-through subject, under this block of code, we are expecting a user. Therefore, going to call or to assign login success user from the user parameter. All right. And we're going to fulfill the expectation related to the pass-through subjects. We have to store in cancellables. The next state that we have to observe is auth state. We have to drop first and sync. And first of all, we have to append the values to the observed auth states array. Let's store this under cancellables. Now we have to specify basically when to fulfill the expectation. To fulfill the expectation, we need to make sure that the cached user matches the data from mock data, or you can add it from database. It's up to you. I'm going to check again under the database by doing an user equal state and authenticated user because it is a nullable value. In this case, try to get the cached user from the database by doing try and await get cached user data. I'm going to make sure that the user as well as cached user are the same by calling xct assert equal user and cached user. In this case, we're going to fulfill the expectation. The third state that we have to observe basically is the changes of the login form state. Drop first and sync, and we have to append the observed state to the list or to the array, which is observed login state. I'm going to store under constables. Next, we have to change the states of the login form state to assign the new value of the email to email. Login form state and copy email from the mock data and correct email. Likewise for the password. By doing this, we're going to store something inside the observed login state. Now we have to trigger the event on login form event. If we have an error, we have to fail the test because we are expecting no errors in this case. Underneath, we're going to wait for the fulfillment of two expectations, the expectation as well as the login event expectation. Now it's time to make the assertions. We want to make sure that the observed login state contains the latest value of the email. Login state contains, for the criteria here, the first parameter and email equal mock data and email, or the correct email. Likewise, for the assertion for the password, we want to make sure that we have correctly set the states to the correct data. Here, it's got to be password and correct password. The next assertion, we need to make sure that the login success user, I'm talking about this one that we have done before, this particular value is not null, which is very important. If this value is not null, which means that we have some data to serve to our UI. And the data is basically the user data. Next, we need to make sure that this login success user matches the user data from the database. Therefore, I'm going to surround this block with task. I'm going to move this assertion inside the task. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to make the assertion. I think that's all we can do under this particular test. Let's go ahead and run the test under auto view model test. Finger crossed, let's go. And the test succeeded. Very good. We need to make sure that the login will fail after passing more credentials. As usual, we have to arrange the view model and we make sure that the view model as well as the memory database are not null. And you have to set the expectations or the expectation for this case. Let's add as usual the arrays that's going to hold for us the observed state, login state, as well as the auth state. This time I'm going to assign email to non-existent email, as well as some random password. We need to observe right now the changes of the auth state inside the sync function. We have to append to the array or to the observed auth state array the dedicated state. And we have to get the authenticated user from the state. Basically, if we are able to do so, we have to fail the test because we are expecting no user to be emitted to the publisher. The next state that we have to observe is the login form state. In this case, we're just going to append to the array observed login states. Next, we have to change the values for the email and password under login form state. And we have to act by calling view model and to trigger the event on login form event. Here we can do some assertions. We need to make sure that the error is not null. If the error is not null, we have to fulfill the expectation of the test. Next, we need to wait for the expectation to be fulfilled. And we need to do the usual assertions to make sure that we have changed the value of the email and the value of the password. And we need to make sure that there is no cached user in the database. We're going to assert that the cached user is null. That's all for this test. And let's run the test. And the test passed. Now let's test the register function. It should sign up the user. First things first, we have to create the view model. We have to make sure that the view model is not null. And we have to set the expectation. Let's create the observed values to be stored under the array. Let's call it observed register states, for example. And let's arrange the values of the username, email, and password. Now we have to store the observed states under the observed register states array by calling view model and register form states and sync. We have to store under constables inside this particular section. We're going to do observed register state and append states. As simple as this. Next, we're going to change the states of the username, the email, password, and password confirmation. And we have to act basically by calling or triggering the events on register from event from the view model. We can make our assertions here. We need to make sure that the username that we have assigned here matches this registered username. Afterward, we have to fulfill the expectation. In this case, we are not expecting any errors. If we got an error, we have to fail the test. Underneath, we're going to wait for the expectations to be fulfilled so we can make our assertions. For the assertions, we're just going to make sure that we have correctly submitted the correct data by checking the username, email, password, and password confirmation. That's pretty much it for this test. Let's go ahead and run the test. And the test passed. Let's go ahead and test the other function or the other event, which is logout event. We need to make sure that the logout event should sign out the user. As usual, we need to create the view model and check if we have an instance of view model and memory database as well as mock crypto service, and try to seed some data because we need to simulate right now that we have an active user or an active session. Let's seed some data. Next, we need to save to the keychain the correct token. Let's try to get first of all the existing user. Let's rename this existing user to cached user and check if it is null. If it's null, we have to fail the test. Now let's arrange the expectation. Underneath, we're going to act by calling or triggering the event on event logout. For the user ID, it is basically cached user and ID. For the on logged out, what you have to do here, if it's logged out, we need to fulfill the expectation. And if you have an error, in this case, we have to fail the test if we have an error. Underneath, we have to wait for the expectation to be fulfilled. Afterward, we can make our assertions. Now we are expecting that the user is no longer under the database. Therefore, let's try to get another user by calling, for example, user after logout, memory database, and get cached user. The assertion here is very obvious. We need to make sure that this user or user after logout is null. All right, that's pretty much it for this test. Let's go ahead and run the test. And the test succeeded. One last test before wrapping up this video. Let's make sure that the logout function should not sign out user after passing wrong token. Let's try to do the same thing here. Surround this block with task, and let's save the existing user from the memory database and call get cached user data. We have to fail the test basically if this existing user is null. Let's set the expectations, and you have to trigger the event on auth event logout. For the user is cached user and ID, on logout, and on error. If this block of code is triggered, we have done something wrong under the implementation of onLogout event. Therefore, we have to fail the test if this block of code is executed. If this block of code is triggered, we have to fulfill the expectation. Underneath this function, we need to wait for the expectation to be fulfilled, and we have to make the assertion that we have done before, the user after logout. In this particular case, this value should not be null. And that's all for this test. Let's go ahead and run the test. And the test succeeded. Let's try to make sure there is no interference by running all tests at once. And all tests succeeded. That's very good. And basically that's gonna wrap up our today's video. For the next video, we're going to focus on the presentation layer, the user menu, as well as the toolbar, the login form, and register form. I hope you have learned something new. See you in the next one, and happy coding!